you to the session with Professor Mr. Cull. Professor, we are so pleased to host you here in Istanbul. Our discussion today will mainly focus on the concept of reputational security, and Professor Cull will define the concept and explain why reputational security is relevant today, especially in the light of contemporary challenges. Well, Professor Cull will make a presentation regarding the concept of reputational security. Then we will have a short discussion session, so we will address our questions to Mr. Cull. Firstly, before we begin the presentation, I would like to introduce Professor Cull. Even though many of you are interested in the field of public diplomacy and already familiar with the studies and the works of Professor Cull. So Nicholas Cull is a professor of public diplomacy at the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. Originally from Britain, he is leading historian of role of media and culture in foreign policy and pioneer of public diplomacy studies. And his publications include books of the history of British and American public policy, public diplomacy, and the standard introduction to the field, Public Diplomacy Foundations for Global Engagement in Digital Age. This is available in Mandarin, Italian, Korean, Spanish, and Persian translations. He has developed the idea of reputational security as a way to respond to the more hostile contemporary international environment. His book on this subject, reputational security, and the name of which is Reputational Security, Refocusing Public Diplomacy for a Dangerous Age, is now in press. He has assisted in many foreign ministries and cultural centers around the world, particularly those of the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Mexico, and Switzerland. His ongoing projects include a complete history of role of public diplomacy in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. And in March 2023, 1 month ago, he named Distinguished Scholar by the Diplomatic Studies section of the International Studies Association. Professor Cull, we are so pleased to host you here. I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank all the participants, audiences, for their attention today. I would like to begin as, if you're available, if you're ready now.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the floor is yours, Mr. Cull.
Thank you. So, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Good. The first thing to say is how wonderful it is to be here in Istanbul, and I'd like to thank the Directorate of Communications for hosting me. Especially as they hosted me back in December, so I think twice within a few months is very nice. And it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to listen to colleagues speaking yesterday and to see how our ideas are coming together. So my talk is called From Soft Power to Reputational Security, Public Diplomacy for Dangerous Times. And what I want to talk about, first of all, is the world crisis, which I think is threatening the security of us all. I want to talk about one of the solutions I see within this crisis, which is attention to this concept of reputational security. And then I want to apply that concept to foreign policy and talk about some of the foreign policy responses that I think can enhance our reputational security and through that our security in general. And my conclusion will deal with the way ahead. And if you just take away one thing from this talk, what I hope it will be is that good public diplomacy is not just about things that countries need to do. It also must address things that countries need to stop doing. So I see public diplomacy as extending beyond the realm of communication into the wider realm of government policy. The concept of reputational security was something that I sketched in the conclusion of my 2019 book, Public Diplomacy: Foundations for Global Engagement in the Digital Age. And it is now the center of this new text coming out in December, which Oğuz was just mentioned to you, where I have 8 essays dealing with various aspects of reputational security. First of all, our world crisis. Many of the papers yesterday addressed aspects of this world crisis. First of all, our politics is in crisis, if only because the problems of the world today are too big for any single international actor to deal with. Kofi Annan, when he was Secretary General of the United Nations, put it this way. He said, problems are now without passports. They cross boundaries, and that means that solutions have to cross boundaries too. But if nations of the world are divided against each other, how can we generate solutions? So the problems are too big for any single actor, and because the problems are too big, countries tend to look inwards to maybe unproductive domestic political answers as an alternative to dealing with the great problems of the day. Secondly, our diplomacy is in crisis. I think diplomats around the world have lost credibility, and nation states have lost authority as they speak about problems, and in part this is to do with being unable to generate solutions as the world currently exists. But it also is to do with the nature of communications media. In the world of social media means that we can connect to the people we trust most, which is people exactly like ourselves. And if you're a 15-year-old girl, you can have a world made up entirely, an information world made up entirely of information filtered through other 15-year-old girls. If you're a 26-year-old man, the same thing. Your entire world filtered through people exactly like yourself. The problem is, as diplomats, how do we communicate with people necessarily who are not like ourselves, because our whole job is to communicate with people who are necessarily different. Third problem is the media itself, which is not just a tricky thing to deal with as it's always been, it's now actually been weaponized by people who mean us ill on the world stage. This is made worse by the fact we're at a moment of technological transition. And my background is, as Oğuz says, as a historian. And as a historian, I've learned to be very cautious and alarmed at moments of technological transition, because publics are especially susceptible to manipulation by media at moments of technological transition. In fact, when I look back at the way the greatest crises of our past century developed, they're all linked in some way to a world made more unstable by technological transition. It's just we don't talk about them that way. So I see the First World War as being the war made by readily available mass circulation newspapers, whose interest it was to exaggerate the flaws of neighbors. I see World War II as the war made by the newsreel and the radio, which made it possible for different kinds of regimes to take control of publics in the 1930s. And I see the Cold War as being this thing made much worse by the new coming of television. So in our own age, we need to go through a process of coming to terms with new media in order to regain international stability. The world right now lacks media-specific skepticism. As children, we're taught, don't believe everything you read in the newspaper, right? That's part of what your father tells you when you're a kid. But we haven't yet quite got to the stage where mistrusting social media is proverbial. That is a skill. Maybe some people learned during the pandemic. It's increasing, but we need to help that along. And I see that as being part of how we restabilize our society. And this was certainly a point that was made yesterday in that excellent panel on the crisis of propaganda and disinformation. And finally, we see the rise of the public as a factor in international relations, which has led to much more attention on the international stage to issues of media and to soft power. And I know Turkey is one of the countries that has paid a lot of attention to issues of soft power. These multiple factors led me to understand the extent to which reputation is now central to international affairs. But I want to turn now to the subject of reputation. And how does reputation link to security? So first of all, reputation is an ancient dimension of statecraft. The great leaders of the past understood that their reputations enhanced their power in the world, that their reputations made it possible for them to do more than they could otherwise. Whether you're talking about Alexander, whether you're talking about Suleiman, this is a familiar part of statecraft. But international relations theory has neglected reputation, except in the idea of trying to understand somebody's reputation for action. So there's a wide international relations literature on the business of reputation for resolution, the resolute response, meaning will leader X retaliate if provoked? So the theory of reputation in IR has focused on will a president press the nuclear button, to be blunt, if threatened. However, the wider practice of international relations has moved on. We now see reputation as being central to the global market, with concepts like national brand coming into play, and other concepts which relate to reputation, like, for example, soft power. When I look at the past as a historian, I'm struck by how often reputation played a key role in the outcome of the crisis. One crisis that I'm particularly interested in is the crisis in the immediate origin of World War II, where Britain had to choose whether it would support Czechoslovakia or not, when Czechoslovakia was threatened by Hitler. And when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain explained his decision not to support Czechoslovakia, he actually told the British people that it was unthinkable to contemplate war for as he put it, a country, a far country, of whose people we know nothing. Or he said it more, of whose people we know nothing, like that. But of whose people we know nothing, which is to say, if the country had been better known, would a different response have been possible? Just 6 months later, we saw that yes, different responses were possible when Chamberlain and the French government chose to guarantee the frontiers of Poland. I compared how British newspapers had talked about Czechoslovakia and Poland over the previous 20 years and found that in the London Times there were twice as many mentions of Poland as there were of Czechoslovakia. In the Manchester Guardian, there were 4 times as many mentions of Poland as there were of Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain was telling the truth. British people really did not know much about Czechoslovakia, and Czechs that I've spoken to say, yes, they think that it was part of what was missing. And maybe even if they'd have had a different name in 1938, a name that resonated historically, like, for example, if they'd all agreed to be Bohemia, they might have been treated differently. In our own time, the frame for reputation has been this term, soft power. My problem with thinking about soft power is that it has tended to accentuate positives only. When governments seek to develop soft power, they talk about spreading the news of wonderful things in the country, like, for example, their gastronomy, or their music, or their dance culture, or their cinema or television programs. This limits, I think, the dimension that we shouldn't only think about talking about positives, we should also think about eliminating negatives. At key points in American public diplomacy, the elimination of negatives intruded into policy making. I have 3 examples of this, and I think it was too rare in American foreign policy, but there are 3 examples of moments when the US government realized it was going to have to protect its reputation by changing reality. The first of these was when first President Eisenhower and then President Kennedy decided that American racism was such a problem that in order to counter communist propaganda about American racism, they would have to actually reduce the racism, not just deny the problem. So part of the reason that Eisenhower and Kennedy responded to the civil rights movement was to have a better reality for Cold War purposes. Similarly, a few years later, President Johnson realized he was going to have to make the American immigration system less racist in order to deliver a better image and a better reality for the country. Thirdly, in the 1970s, President Jimmy Carter realized that he was going to have to address human rights problems, the problem of hypocrisy in American foreign policy. So at least in some aspects of American foreign policy, they began to insist on high standards of human rights, not only from enemies, but also from allies. And this had its own problems in US foreign policy, but it was an attempt to change reality rather than just change rhetoric. I think that if we look at the world today, we have to see that public diplomacy has changed. It's not just about accentuating positives in ourselves, it's also now increasingly struggles over reputation. Think, for example, of the recent struggle between China and Australia, where those 2 countries were seeking to undermine one another in their presentation of international education. Or think about the Gulf crisis. There was a whole series of public diplomacy events that we see coming out of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, mutually demonizing each other, or demonizing Qatar specifically, and Qatar then seeking to undermine the other 2 countries using public diplomacy tools to say, oh, the other one is bad, to allege corruption in the other one's government, and back and forth, back and forth. And as a global audience, a lot of what the negative things we know now about the Gulf come from this propaganda battle that took place during the crisis in 2017. One of the things that made me realize that reputation was now central to world affairs was the fate of Ukraine in 2014. Part of the tragedy for Ukraine in 2014 is that when it was threatened by Russia, it lacked a sufficient reputation to alarm international audiences, to provoke the kind of outrage that was deserved when a country loses one province and has other provinces occupied by a foreign army. This should be an instant thing that the global community responds to. But people didn't know enough about Ukraine. The country's name wasn't even consistently reported in the US media. Sometimes people were still using the old Soviet term, the Ukraine. People didn't even know what the capital city was called consistently. Sometimes it was, or most often it was still spelt Kiev in the US media. But since 2014, the government of Ukraine has embarked on a massive program of public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy and outreach to explain itself, to tell the world what the country was about, to explain its narrative, and to make sure that the country had come alive in people's imaginations. And by 2022, something different had come into being, and we can see the difference. In 2014, Ukraine lacked reputational security. By 2022, it had acquired reputational security, which was then enhanced by the spectacle of the bravery of the people of Ukraine in coming together against the Russian invasion. And so I think that Russia's invasion of Ukraine added the final element to the reputational security of Ukraine, and that in the future, when we study public diplomacy, the great case study of our time will be how did Ukraine come to reintroduce itself to the world and provoke this amazing response of sympathy, because not every country that gets invaded is supported to the extent that Ukraine has been supported by the people of the world, as well as by governments and corporations and non-governmental organizations and all the other outpourings that we've seen since the invasion took place in earnest last February. One of the things I like about the concept of reputational security is that it isn't necessarily confined to one country. Another problem with soft power is that it tends to turn the issue of international reputation into a kind of beauty contest or a battle royale of all countries against each other to see who's the nicest, who has the best cuisine. You know, is it France versus Turkey as the great cuisine country of the world? And I see that as unproductive because I happen to like both cuisines very much. I would argue that reputational security problems are being addressed at a regional or even a system-wide level. A good example of a regional response is the way in which the European Union has come together to fight disinformation with its European Union versus disinformation platform. The whole community of Europe is helped by collective responses. Europe is also fighting disinformation through collective regulation, which I think is actually helping everybody else too. We see collective advancements around human rights and other kinds of collaborative activities happening on an international level. All of this comes to my final section in the talk, and that is the challenge for policy. What can policy do to enhance reputational security? So I would say the first thing, or the first implication of public diplomacy, the first implication for public diplomacy from reputational security is that we need to be known abroad. Countries need, as part of their security, to be known abroad. We need to have strong outreach, and this should include cultural work. I think it's through culture, it's one of the most important ways in which countries can show their relevance to a global audience, by sharing their culture. Secondly, we know that what countries admire most in other countries is their goodness, meaning their contribution to the success of human endeavor elsewhere in the world. And in order to be good, you need to be good in areas that are relevant to international audiences. One of the frustrations looking at a place like, for example, Taiwan, is that historically they talked about how they were good at calligraphy. And this made sense in a Chinese world order, but it isn't that interesting if you don't speak Mandarin and you aren't a connoisseur of calligraphy. Talking about Taiwan's calligraphy is kind of a waste of time for most audiences around the world. It's better to talk about Taiwan's artistic freedom, for example, or excellence in its filmmaking. That is something that's more relevant. If you want to be good in relevant areas, you need to know your audience, and you need to understand what audiences around the world care about. So that takes us back to the first starting point of my work on public diplomacy, which is telling people, in the first instance, listen. Thirdly, you need to minimize negative realities. You can't conduct public diplomacy purely by asking your Directorate of Communications to talk about nice, good things in the country. Our adversaries who are using media to attack us attack real problems and issues. This is part of why disinformation and propaganda are causing such damage to countries around the world, because they are picking genuine deficiencies, as with the genuine racism in the United States, the genuine inequalities in the United States, the genuine gun violence in the United States, and they are turning that into a foreign policy problem. Therefore, the foreign policy solution has to be to generate innovative and new and positive responses to those problems. Not just to say, in the case of the United States, you know, the Grand Canyon's a fantastic place. Look at the Grand Canyon, don't look at the gun violence. Fourthly, some countries have developed reputational security by default, without ever hearing the term, without ever thinking about it. They have a good reputation. People like them, and a good reputation has consequences. And I was very moved by the international response to the Turkish earthquake. It was so upsetting when that happened. And in my own community, I was able to ask neighbors to provide, we collected sleeping bags, we collected coats to send through the consulate of Turkey to the damaged places. And it showed that people cared about Turkey. It was wonderful how little children were bringing in donations for the country. That was a response to a pre-existing good feeling that people had towards Turkey. But you can have even more of that if you seek to steer into it and enhance it through policy. I think that we can also develop new kinds of policies. Particularly in diplomacy, we have a tradition. When we're challenged by a new weapon, we negotiate about the weapon. And maybe it's time to have international negotiations about mutual use of disinformation, because something that wasn't talked about so much in the wonderful disinformation panel yesterday was the fact that governments are doing this disinformation to each other, that these are state-backed propaganda campaigns, state-subsidized propaganda campaigns. And when the state is doing something, another state can talk about it and can negotiate a quid pro quo to behave differently. And one of the things I talk about in the book is examples of when that has happened in the past and when states have stopped propaganda campaigns and disinformation campaigns because of successful negotiation. I believe there is a potential for information disarmament or media disarmament that the world has to take advantage of before it's too late. My conclusion, the way ahead. There are many advantages to approaching the issue of public diplomacy through the lens of reputational security. One of those is that by talking about the linkages between communication policy and regular policy, by explaining that communications is a security necessity, you get a bigger budget. You can argue for it. This is a way to argue for an appropriate budget. Second, we can seek out cooperation around issues of reputation for collective success by each helping one another to be relevant to solutions. We can help each other to be stable. Third, international audiences, and I say this after many years of studying them, are not stupid. They have a way of detecting confusion in policy, and they have a way of smelling out hypocrisy. So we should be really careful not to endorse one thing and do another. We should not fulfill our detractors' stereotype of ourselves. And in work I did for the British government, for the Foreign Office, writing a report on British public diplomacy in support of the Baltics, in support of Ukraine, I felt it was really important to stress that it's no help if you say we oppose the oligarchs, but you still let them buy houses in London. This is hypocrisy, and all the world can tell that. We need to listen to global responses. We need to pay attention to international audiences. And part of the problem with, part of the need to listen to global audiences is that we're blind to our own biases. We don't actually see ourselves what's wrong with us. And sometimes we focus on things that others aren't bothered by. So it's really important that we understand how we are seen by other countries. Images of countries are incredibly stable. Part of the problem for the global influence industry, the people who try and sell nation brands on the world stage, is that people already know what they think about countries. They adjust their image over decades, not instantly, not quickly enough to allow a big claim to be made for the success of something as crude as a marketing campaign. But it's worth attending to the realities that underpin reputation, and I see reputational security as a key concept for 21st century security, and a really important way of rethinking our security in the coming years. As with public diplomacy, the first step, the beginning of reputational security, is to listen. Thank you very much for your attention. You can email me at cull@usc.edu, follow me on Twitter, and I have a small podcast called #PeoplePlacesPower with the British analyst Simon Anholt. But thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you very much. Well, I just would like to thank you again. Thanks a lot. Well, Professor Cull, thank you very much. Due to the time limitation, I have to restrict the questions. I have collected some questions, and I would like to address you. First of all, I would like to thank you again for the detailed presentation, and you explained that the global security environment has been transformed, and that points out that our understanding of concept of security also requires thinking. So we can tell that there's a huge change. So additionally, I understand that public opinion is at the heart of the concept of reputational security, I can say. And the concepts focus on how the images and reputations of the actors shape the international relations and affect the respective countries' security, actually. So accordingly, we understand that the reputation is seen as vital to the nation state's security. So in this context, lastly, the international actors also consider that they realize that their policies, their images are judged by the international audience. So in this context, how can international actors strengthen their reputational security, and as their practices observed by the international audiences in a globalized world?
Well, I think that.
Yeah, press the button, please. Yeah.
Press the button.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Can we activate the microphone, please?
Maybe I have to still keep on this one. Sorry. Well, so the question is, how do you start? I guess is what you're asking. I think the first thing is to listen, to understand what your country means in the world, and to look at your assets, to look at where the threats are coming from to your reputation, and to understand sometimes we are our own worst enemies, and the problems in your image don't come from mischievous enemies, but from problems internally that have yet to be addressed. And I see this as a particular issue for the United States right now, but all countries have something that they need to think about. So, I'm concerned that in many places in the world, public diplomacy is seen as an optional extra of foreign policy. That the foreign policy is decided, and then they call in the communications people to sell what has been decided to the world. And I think this is getting it the wrong way round. And in fact, nobody in business would approach it this way. They're all the while they're doing market research, and sometimes you realize you need a different product or a better product, and that never seems to come up or seldom seems to come up in policy discussions. So those are just a few implications of the concept.
I see. So additionally, I would like to mention about the global problems.
Yes.
You know that the global problems are too big to tackle down by a single or just nation state. So any country may not tackle the problems alone. So nation states urge to cooperate to address shared concerns. So how can nation states cooperate in an environment of competition, and what is the relation of it with the reputational security in the context of international cooperation?
Well, that's a good question. I think that the first thing is to realize that we need to cooperate, and then to look at the architecture of cooperation. And I think that my understanding of partnership is that somebody needs to be in charge, or you need to arrange a platform. And part of the problem with platforms right now is a lack of legitimacy. So having a difficult conversation about helping the UN re-emerge as a viable platform for this kind of conversation, I think is an important way to go, because it has legitimacy, and yet there are some aspects of how the UN has functioned that I think undermine its its credibility in particular areas. You know, as I'm sure you're all aware. Does that make sense as a sort of a starting point?
Definitely.
Yeah, but certainly, when I've looked at international collaborations, somebody needs to be in charge, somebody needs to create a platform, and somebody needs to be credible in articulating a vision. So I think, in fact, there are public diplomacy solutions to the need to collaborate, and that at its heart, collaboration is a communication problem as much as it is a coordination or a management problem, that it begins with better communication. So this should be on the agenda.
Thank you. Well, another thing that I was really interested that a few minutes ago you mentioned about the state-backed disinformation and state-backed propaganda. So digital threats such as disinformation, misinformation, they pose challenges to the reputational security, I suppose.
Sure.
So particularly the reputational security of the nation states.
Yes.
So their image must be undermined.
Yes.
There's a possibility of it, and in terms of practices of disinformation. So I believe that nation states must be agile to fill information gaps so that their reputational security is protected.
Yes.
So in this context, my question, in today's disinformation ecosystem, which steps can be taken or might be taken to build a resilience against digital challenges?
Well, those are excellent. That's an excellent way of putting it, to think about building resilience. I agree with the panel that we had on disinformation yesterday, that this begins with media literacy and seeing what can we do to develop media literacy at a global level. And I'm really encouraged by work that has been happening through UNESCO, to circle back to my endorsement of the UN as being maybe the best place to begin with this. UNESCO has done some really interesting work on teaching people critical skills for interpreting journalism in the 21st century, for detecting fake news, and just last week they published an important report on explaining AI and the dangers of deepfake technology manipulating audiences, which I think is going to be something that we have to worry about a lot. But you know, as you will remember from my talk, one of the solutions that I got very interested in writing the book was this idea of information disarmament. And we know that the Russian use of disinformation as a kind of a weapon of choice in the war against Ukraine had a prehistory in Soviet use of disinformation throughout the Cold War. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union really developed an emphasis on disinformation, and their favorite story, as KGB people were proud to talk about in their memoirs, was a story about the United States having invented HIV/AIDS as a biological weapon. And that story was very damaging to the reputation of the United States. And so in 1987, the United States government confronted the Soviet government and said, right now we're negotiating about missiles, we're trying to reconcile our two societies in the name of peace, but we also need to talk about propaganda. We also need to talk about information. And unless you stop saying that AIDS is an American bioweapon, the United States will stop collaborating with the Soviet Union on AIDS research. And two things seem to have come into play. One, the Soviet Union valued scientific cooperation with the US, and they understood that if the US ended scientific cooperation in 1 year on AIDS, maybe the next year they'd end all scientific cooperation, which would cause great damage to Soviet research science. But the other thing is they realized the United States, by publicizing the Soviet publicity around AIDS, was damaging the reputation of the Soviet Union and making the Soviet Union look bad. And so Gorbachev took the decision to pledge an end to disinformation. And he said, no more disinformation, we will have a new day, and turned off that story of AIDS as an American bioweapon, certainly in the English language, overnight. And I think that that's a helpful story to understand that sometimes a communication problem doesn't have a communication solution, it has a behind closed doors, diplomat to diplomat negotiated solution. So the ambassadors in the room don't have to think there's nothing for them to do. There's a lot for them to do. There's still a role for negotiation. I don't think you can negotiate with everybody. I don't think every situation is ripe for negotiation right now, but I think we should have it in our mind that at some point negotiation is a dimension of the solution that we shouldn't forget about altogether.
We cannot exclude it. I understand. Thank you. Well, lastly, my last question. Due to time restriction, I need to ask my last question. As an relevant discipline of public diplomacy, so I'm in the cultural diplomacy. I don't want to go out of the context, but how about the contribution of cultural diplomacy to the reputational security?
Well,
so what are your comments?
That's such a good question, because I think that culture is the soul of reputation. And one of the things that strikes me about culture is how culture is the route to developing empathy. Now, those of you who are ambassadors, who are diplomats, have been trained, or if you were British or American, you'd be trained what to do if you were ever, God forbid, taken hostage. And the training, if you're taken hostage, is to begin to talk to your captor and to say, oh, my name is X, I have 3 fine sons at home, they'll be missing me, I really like to listen to music, or these are my favorite movies, to start talking about who you are and what you like, because empathy makes it harder for them to mistreat you. I think cultural diplomacy is the global application of the same principle, that in a way in the modern world we are all one another's hostage. So we can use cultural diplomacy as a way of developing empathy in one another. Caring about one another, thinking about one another as human beings, this will make the world a better place. This is one of the barriers to mistreating each other. It's hard to mistreat people you know. It's hard to mistreat people who you understand, see the world in the same way as you. So for me, cultural diplomacy is the global equivalent or the reputational security equivalent of showing your hostage taker the family photo. And that's a very powerful thing to do. And I think, I don't believe, rather, that cultural diplomacy has been explained to governments as being that essential, as a way of actually stopping or inhibiting hostility and the inhumanity of others in world affairs towards ourselves. And I know from my idea of reputational security did not come out of my own head. It came out of traveling and talking to government officials in small places, in dangerous places in this world. And I realized that the world looks different. It looks one way in Washington, D.C. It looks a different way if you live in Pristina in Kosovo. It looks a different way if you live in what was then called Astana in Kazakhstan, and it was officials in Kazakhstan, officials in Kosovo, who would talk about how they felt when an athlete from their country won an Olympic medal. And they would say, knowing, as when a lady from Kosovo won a medal for judo, this might make the difference between the country getting enough recognition internationally to survive or not. And people in the government in Kazakhstan felt the same way. There were examples of small recognitions of Kazakhstan they felt gave them an edge and gave them a better chance of prospering than if they were unknown on the world stage.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, I would also like to thank all the audiences for honoring us, for joining in this session. And I also would like to thank Professor Cull for your valuable presentation, your comments, for enlightening us, actually. I also thank, again, for the audiences that, due to the time limit, we need to conclude our panel here. Thank you very much for your participation. I will not be able to accept questions. I'm really sorry about that. Thank you so much. We need to finish our panel. Thanks a lot.